Hey guys, just want to check before I jump into anything if you guys can hear me all right. Someone could just say yep in the chat. That would be great because last week we had some microphone and video problems. So let me know if you can hear me all right. Yes, no. There's only 2 of you in here right now, so one of you is going to need to let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going here. All right, so today's topic in AP Psych is dreams and drugs, and that comes in the altered states of consciousness unit. It's a pretty teeny tiny unit, and so we're going to kind of cruise through it, but I will stick around at the end tonight. I'm going to show a smaller FRQ prompt, and if you want to take a few minutes to like write it out and type it out, I'll give you guys some feedback at the end of the night tonight. So that's a little bonus if you stick around till the end. You will get some free FRQ practice and feedback. All right, so jumping in then. Just to look at our upcoming schedule, we always have a look here. We're going to start the sensation and perception unit next week. That's a pretty big one, so we've got 2 sessions devoted to it. And then at the end of October, we move on to development, which is another pretty big unit. So we will have some big things to be covering in the next few weeks. So make sure you're registered and signed up so you don't forget or miss a session. So this unit, like I said, is altered states of consciousness. And basically, it focuses on how various states of consciousness, either through drug use or sleep, or my textbook even talks about hypnosis, all of those different states of consciousness impact our experience and our behaviors. It's only 2 to 4% of the AP exams. There's not a lot of heavy content here, but you do need to at least know some of these things. And so our focus tonight is mostly going to be on sleep and drugs because those are the 2 main factors. But we can talk about other stuff. I'm going to do in November kind of a fun session about kind of common myths and things that go along with psychology. And so we're going to talk about hypnosis then. So if you have questions about that, you'll have to kind of keep them in mind for November. And then we're going to talk about some other just like myths related to psychology. So, but for tonight, dreams and drugs or sleep and drugs, those are our main focus. And so first to start with, I want to make sure we all are on the same page when we're talking about consciousness, what that actually means. And so for AP Psych, what we're talking about with consciousness is just this idea that we're aware of what's happening around us. I am consciously aware that I am presenting right now and that I can, hear the neighbor's dog barking outside and all this stuff. It's in my level of awareness. I'm processing it and thinking about it. It's in my conscious awareness. And then this idea of stream of consciousness is basically that like consciousness flows. It's not, if you've ever seen those like stop animation movies where it's like dit, 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 consciousness isn't like that, right? It flows. Life would be really weird if it was kind of like stop animation and we had like one moment is happening, the next moment's happening, the next. Instead, everything flows smoothly, and that's like our stream of consciousness is just this flow of awareness that happens around us. But we also have something beyond the conscious mind. And so there's 2 kind of theories here that you need to know of. We'll talk a lot more about the Freud theory later on, but for this unit, you just kind of need to know that Freud talks about the unconscious mind as well. And basically, it's like this hiding spot deep inside of us where we keep like our desires and emotions that would maybe be like taboo, like we can't act on them, so we keep them buried below the surface. And that's where this iceberg analogy comes from. It's that like our conscious awareness is the top of this iceberg, and so that's the part that we all see, that we're aware of. And so that's like our everyday thinking and interaction with our environment. But then there's this like huge part of the iceberg that's below the surface, and that's our like hiding spot, for our like secret drives and desires. And we'll talk a lot more about Freud later on in the year. Currently, today, when we think of conscious or unconscious mind, it's more of like there's things happening in the back of my mind that I'm not constantly focused or aware of. And it's just in the bio unit, like that idea of dual processing. My brain can focus on more than one thing at a time, which is probably a good thing. It allows us to multitask and everything else. But because my brain can focus on more than one thing at a time, I'm not always consciously aware of what's going on in the background. And so today we think that that's like more of the unconscious mind. It's those things that are happening kind of under our awareness, but they're there and they're happening. So not quite like the iceberg like Freud would talk about. Just a reminder, if I'm going too fast or if you guys have any questions tonight, you can hit that ask a question button down at the bottom of your screen and type something in, or you could always feel free to interact with me in the chat. You know, I wish we could chat a little bit more and have a little more interactive stuff going on. So anytime, feel free to jump in there, ask a question, or even chat with each other. So this unit is not just about the conscious mind, but it's about the altered state of our conscious mind. So an altered state of consciousness is basically like when my beta waves, so if I hooked you up to like a brain scan and was measuring your brain waves, our beta waves are just our like normal awake brain waves. And so an altered state of consciousness would be any sort of state that derives from those normal kind of bouncing beta waves. And that could happen in a lot of ways. And so there's like states that occur spontaneously, like you drift off and you're daydreaming in the middle of class. We actually might see like altering of the brainwaves because you're not fully conscious or fully present in what's happening in class. So that kind of just happens. You don't mean to daydream, but you kind of slip into that altered state of consciousness. Some things are physiologically induced. Physical things are happening in your body causing those sensations. Hallucinations are a good example, especially with like drugs. There's something physically happening in your body that's causing your consciousness to switch and flip from those normal brain beta waves. And then some are psychologically induced. Sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and like I said, we'll talk more about hypnosis and whether that's accepted as kind of a real thing or not, or even like meditation. If we put the EEG stuff on your head and we're like measuring people who are like really good at actually like meditating and focusing and kind of releasing, we would see that their brain waves would alter and switch into a more calm or different state. And so all of those are different examples of altering our state of consciousness, some to maybe a more alert state and some to a less alert state. But the sensory deprivation one is actually really cool. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this or not, but if you Google like quietest room on earth, or quietest room on earth would work. And I think it's in the University of Minnesota. I'm trying to bring up on my notes here specifically where it is. But it's this really cool room, and it's the quietest room on earth. I don't know how they do it. There's a whole spiel about all of the different things they put on the walls to basically mute sound. And I mean, I think we all think we know quiet, like we've been in a quiet room or a quiet place. But this room is so quiet that after like a minute or 30 seconds, you actually can start to hear your blood flow like through your veins, and like you can hear yourself like swallow. And so you can actually hear the like physiological functions happening in your body. And so you could see how like being deprived of the sense of sound in this case could really start to like trip you out and cause like an altered state of consciousness. And so people only stand there for like a minute or two before they really start to like freak out because it is such a weird and trippy experience. But there's like a video on it. If you Google like world's quietest room, you should be able to find it. But it's really interesting how just things like that can alter our state of consciousness, but also how like just that you could hear your blood flow. It just seems so weird to me. But yeah, so those are all various altered states of consciousness. And we're going to focus for the next few slides just on psychoactive drugs. And psychoactive drugs are just like things that we put in our system that interact with our body's functioning, basically. And so there's three main categories. You have to know the three categories for the test, because what I've seen before is they'll ask you like, they'll describe a type of drug and then say, is that a depressant, a stimulant, or a hallucinogenic drug? And so depressants, I think, are easy to remember because of the word depress. And so basically they depress our neural functioning. So if we think back to the bio unit and how like neurons fire and how fast that happens, what it happens is they kind of dampen or dull our neural responses. So our reaction time becomes slower, maybe not as efficient. And so you could see like all kinds of problems that would come with that. And we'll talk a little bit more about them. Stimulants then are the opposite, because stimulate means to like excite, arouse, whatever. And basically stimulants speed up our body functioning. So depressants slow it down, stimulants speed it up. And then the last brand or type, I guess not brand, type is the hallucinogenic drugs. And those basically distort our perception. And so I might see spiders coming out of the wall, there's not actually spiders coming out of the wall, but I believe there are. And so it actually plays with like my senses, and it makes me see things that aren't there, hear things that aren't there, smell things that aren't there. But they feel very real to you because your brain is basically like into seeing those things, and there's no way for you to know if those are real or not. So that's why people on like hallucinogenic drugs experience a lot of paranoia and things like that, because they feel like these things are actually happening. They're convinced of them, even though they're not really there, because to them it is there, it is real, it is happening. So specifically speaking, we talk a little bit about tolerance and addiction as well, just kind of it falls into this unit. And the big thing that you need to know for like tolerance and addiction then is how the different ways that we become addicted or dependent upon these substances. And the first is physical dependence. And that's because, like we just talked about, these drugs, no matter if it's a stimulant, depressant, whatever, they interact with your brain and they cause changes to the physiological functions that are happening in your brain. And so a physical dependence is basically when you physically like need the drug. You feel sick, like physically ill. You might throw up, you might sweat, you might get headaches, all of these different things because of this need for whatever the drug is. And so an example of this would be the dopamine receptors in your brain. So think back, we talked about dopamine in the bio unit, and dopamine is kind of like that feel-good drug. It makes us feel good. And so what actually happens is when you start to become addicted to a substance, because you're filling with like an opiate, for example, like heroin, you take it and it's replacing the dopamine in your brain. So your brain actually stops producing dopamine because it's getting enough of it from the drug. And then when you stop eventually taking the drug, and then your brain is also not producing that dopamine, you feel really, really sick. You feel like garbage because now you have no dopamine in your system. And so that's how kind of addiction works, is that it really hooks you in because your body changes in response to that. The other big thing that happens is if you stop taking drugs for a while, a lot of people end up overdosing because they go back to their like last dose. Like if I don't know how much you would inject of a drug, but if I'm taking 2 pills of a drug to get high at some point, but then I'm off of the drug for a couple of months, and then I go back to those 2 pills, my body is going to go into like a state of shock because of all of, it's not used to that level of drugs. And so that's how people OD. Most people OD after being sober for a while because they return to their like previous dosage, but their bodies have gone back to like a normal level. And so that's how like overdosing happens. The other kind of dependence that happens is psychological. And so basically like, oh, every time I have a fight with my boyfriend, I need to go have a cigarette. And so then I use that like psychological, it makes me feel better in my head. That's how psychological dependence works. Or every morning before I go to work, I have a cigarette with my cup of coffee, and that's just my routine, and I feel like I need it. Those are psychological factors. And so both of them are important to addiction and dependence, but just being able to differentiate a physical versus a psychological one is important. And then we're going to talk specifically about the different drug types. I don't think you need to know a ton about them, but I have seen them just like asking you to like categorize the drugs. So knowing that a depressant is alcohol or a barbiturate or an opiate, just knowing how to categorize them, I think is important. And I think it's important talking a little bit about like alcohol and stuff because you guys are teenagers, so sometimes that stuff is relevant and timely for you. But so depressants, again, they slow down our neural processing. Alcohol also disrupts our memory formation. So like if we think back again to the bio unit, we're making lots of connections here to the hippocampus. The alcohol actually impacts its ability to form memories, which is sometimes when people say like, oh, I was blackout drunk or whatever, I don't remember that. It's because the alcohol is actually impacting that part of your brain. It's not letting it function and do what it's supposed to. Under alcohol, we also see like the depressing of certain parts of our brain that allow us to have self-control and self-awareness. And so those parts get kind of turned off. And so we might do something outrageous or something inappropriate that we normally wouldn't do, but because those parts of our brain are being depressed because it's a depressant, that's why we may act that way. So don't confuse depressant with like sad. Depressant just means it like slows down or interferes with your neural functioning. Barbiturates are another category of depressant. You don't need to really know much about them except that they fall into that category. And then the last category is opiates. And so the opiates are what I was talking about with the dopamine receptors in the brain. Opiates give us pleasure. They release pain and anxiety. So you could get opiates through pills, right? Prescription pills are definitely legal and you could take them, but you have to be careful to not become dependent on them. So not all psychoactive drugs are illegal. Alcohol is legal for adults. Opiates are illegal if you have a prescription, but that doesn't mean that you can't just take what you want. You still have to be careful with them. And so the opiates, if you take too much or become addicted, your brain stops producing those mechanisms and it causes problems long term. The next category then was stimulants. And the most common stimulant is nicotine, which again is another legal substance if you are of age. And actually, studies have shown that like nicotine is more addictive than like cocaine or meth or other drugs. And so I'll speak from personal experience here. I was a smoker for a long time, and it was really difficult for me to quit. I've quit like 3 or 4 times. And even like I've quit for like a year at a time and then eventually like just start smoking again. And it's really hard because of the like upper feeling that it gives you. And it kind of gives you like an adrenaline rush and that sort of thing. But obviously we know like all of the bad things that are in cigarettes and how like harmful that is for you and for your brain. And I am next week 1 year smoke free again. So hopefully it sticks this time. But people who smoke, there's like a 50% chance of dying from smoking every year. So that's so bad. Those odds are not good. And so everyone who does smoke should try and quit because we know that there's a lot of harmful things that happen there. Causes 5.4 million deaths each year, and only about 1 in 7 people actually end up quitting. So it's a highly, highly addictive substance. Cocaine and meth and ecstasy are all other stimulants. Those are kind of like, you hear them sometimes called as like club drugs or designer drugs because like people who are out partying take them because they like stimulate your nervous system and they like make you jittery and awake and kind of up. Think about though the things that does. If it's like causing your heart to race and your breathing to increase, it's really hard on your body and it's hard on your nervous system, constantly being at that up or high level. And so that's not healthy by any means as well. Other drugs just in that picture like Adderall and Ritalin, those are also considered stimulants, and those are prescription drugs as well. But if they're misused, then you should not be taking those. And then the last category of the psychoactive drugs that you need to know is hallucinogenic. The big one here is LSD. LSD, or acid, it's sometimes called. Basically, you get this varied emotional and sensory experience. Some people describe it as like a near-death experience. It's just like, it's really trippy, it's really weird, and it's almost like you're in a dreamlike state. But the thing with LSD is that like, I don't know, maybe back in the day you heard like people say like, oh, it was a bad trip, right? Like you trip on this drug. You don't know what's going to happen when you take it. Some people take LSD and they have these really like dream-like experience, fluffy clouds and like happy emotions and feelings, and it's this like really cool, really great experience. Some people take LSD and there's spiders coming out of the wall and monsters trying to get them and super big paranoia, and this can last for like hours and hours and hours. And so you never know like when you take LSD what's going to happen. And so you could have this like dream-like positive like touchy-feely experience, or you could have this like horrific horror movie, terrifying experience. And so it's the brain, you never know what's going to happen. Even if you've taken it before and had one experience, you might have the opposite the next time. And to me, that's like really scary with that type of drug, just because you never know. And like the paranoia could last for hours or even days, depending on the dosage that you take. Marijuana is also considered technically to be a mild hallucinogenic drug. It definitely doesn't fall into the same like class or category as LSD, but it definitely still sort of works, because what it does is marijuana amplifies your sensitivity to sensory experiences, taste, touch, things like that. And so technically it falls into the hallucinogenic category. What marijuana does do is it can impair your motor coordination and reaction time, your thinking skills, and it also disrupts memory formation. So we know, actually a study I just saw last week came out talking about how harmful marijuana can be for teenage brains because your brain is still developing and not fully formed. And so that memory disruption and that impaired motor coordination can actually have long-term impacts if you're like a heavy day-to-day marijuana user. So just kind of keep that in mind. But it is also used in some cases as a like Adderall or Ritalin is sometimes used as a treatment method. And so with all of these things, it's all about like how you use them, moderation, and like whether or not you're being prescribed them or not. So, and then I'm not sure if we've touched on the biopsychosocial approach before, but I think we have. We've talked about how when explaining something in psychology, in this case, I'm trying to explain someone's drug use, why someone might become addicted to alcohol or to another substance versus someone else who doesn't. And so just like anything in psychology, it's really, we have to look at the whole picture. And so I like to come back to this because this is like a big deal, a big topic on the test is like understanding the multiple layers or factors that go into something. So if I'm trying to explain someone's drug use, we know that there are hereditary influences on addiction. If you have a parent who's an alcoholic or addicted to a substance, you're also much more likely to have that experience of addiction. And so there's hereditary factors. So biologically speaking, some people are more predisposed than others to addiction. Psychologically speaking, it could be like you have feelings of anxiety or feelings of depression, but how you like think and process about those things make you more susceptible or less susceptible to becoming drug addicted. And then lastly, like the social aspect, if all of your friends are smoking marijuana or taking LSD, you're more likely to go along with that as well. It's the social factor, the social aspect. And so if I just said, well, oh, there's some hereditary factors or, oh, depression plays a role, none of those by themselves are really explanatory to explain drug use. But if we look at someone's complete picture, if we look at their biology, their thinking, their environment, all of those together can give us a better understanding or a deeper understanding why someone may choose to do drugs versus someone else not. So just always kind of keep that in mind. This biopsychosocial gives us a complete picture, a better, deeper understanding of all the factors that go into play for any really behavior, but in this case, drug use. All right, so that is all I really have for psychoactive drugs. The big things are just being able to identify the categories, what goes in the categories, and then like just roughly like what depressant versus stimulant, what those things mean. So if you have any questions, throw them in there. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to talking about sleep and dreaming because that's the other big half of this unit. So sleep, how do we like learn about sleep? This is like a weird thing, right? Because I can't tell you when I'm sleeping what's happening. And so we use the EEG machine. If you've ever seen like on TV, someone with all those like little electrodes stuck all over their head and there's all these like wires coming out, that's an EEG machine. And basically, that's how we measure brain activity is if someone's sleeping, they just go to sleep with all of those things on. And then we measure the waves and what's happening inside their head. And one cool thing that's happened is that we've discovered that our auditory cortex does actually respond even when we're asleep. So basically, even when I go into my altered state of consciousness, which is sleep, I'm still at some teeny tiny level consciously aware of what's going on. Because if people will report hearing a phone call in their dreams, even though it was happening in real life. So maybe the phone was ringing in the background while they were sleeping. They didn't consciously wake up to the phone ringing, but then they'll remember that there was a phone ringing in their dream. And so that consciousness is just a little tiny crack open, and it's still taking in the information that's happening around us, even if we might not be fully consciously aware of that. There's still a lot of questions about sleep. A lot of this is still being researched because we haven't always had the technology to really research and understand these things. But the big thing about the altered state of consciousness with sleep is the different stages that our brain goes through. And you have to know these, you have to memorize them, and you have to know what happens in each one. And so on the right-hand side here would be measurements from an EEG machine. And so it shows just like your waking beta waves. Remember, we talked about those before. And so that's just like a normal alert state. Our waking alpha waves are a little bit different, a little more jagged, a little more rapid and alert. And then the different REM and NREM stages are listed, and we'll go through each of them. But basically what happens is when we sleep, We go through these 4 stages: NREM 1, NREM 2, NREM 3, which is sometimes called delta sleep or delta waves, and then REM. And so NREM 1 is kind of that first stage, so 1, it just kind of makes sense, where we aren't really officially asleep yet, but we're kind of getting there. And so our NREM 1 is characterized by like slow breathing, and you can see there the little orange waves. They're kind of irregular. They look kind of awake and kind of not, because we're still kind of awake at NREM 1. If I was laying here almost asleep, I'm in NREM 1, and someone said my name, I could easily like perk up and be alert and awake again. But it also could easily, if someone left me alone, go into a deep sleep. So you're like in that in-between stage in NREM 1. NREM 1 is where we also experience hallucinatory images. I don't know if you've ever had that. It's really weird, but like you're like falling asleep and all of a sudden you think you see something in like your room. It's kind of creepy. Or if you've experienced the hypnagogic jerk, how many of you have felt that, where you're like falling asleep and then all of a sudden your whole body like twitches and you like wake right up? That's called a hypnagogic jerk. And there's some hypotheses about why that happens. One is that your body actually kind of paralyzes itself when it's going to sleep. And people, doctors hypothesize that that last like jerk is our body like kind of twitching right before we fall into like our paralysis state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on future slides. But NREM 1 is not like a true sleep. You're kind of in, half out stage. NREM 2 then is like our first 20 minutes or so when we're officially asleep. And you can see the waves in NREM 2 become more spread out, more relaxed. And so what's happening here is that we're clearly asleep, but you're still not in that deep sleep. Like if I tapped your shoulder or like shook your shoulder, you'd probably wake up and come to. You're not in that like deep sleep where someone would have to like shout at you or like shake you awake. And the big thing that you have to know about NREM 2 are these things called sleep spindles. And so in NREM 2, we experience like little rapid bursts of brain activity, and those are called sleep spindles. We aren't really sure what they are. It's hypothesized that it has to do with like our memory formation. It's like memories getting filed away as we're starting to fall asleep, but that's not for sure. That's just a hypothesis. Doctors are still studying that, but it is a term I've seen pop up a few times on the AP test. So just know sleep spindles, rapid burst of activity, happens in NREM 2. That's all you really need to know for that. And then NREM 3 lasts for about 30 minutes or so. And that's our like deep sleep. That's when like it would be hard to wake you up. You'd have to shout or shake you awake or something like that. And those are called delta waves. And I think the way that I would remember that is D for delta and D for deep. Delta waves are deep sleep waves. They're deep down. You can see in the NREM 3, there's not a lot of activity going on. It's just kind of lots of troughs and valleys, and it's just slow, rhythmic brain activity happening at this point. And that's our deepest, most restful sleep, is in NREM 3. That lasts for about 30 minutes. And then the last chunk of sleep cycle that we go through is the REM. And so basically, we start to come up in the REM sleep. And this is when our heart rate actually starts to increase. So if I was like measuring like your physiological responses, I would see a marked difference here. Your heart rate, your breathing would become much more rapid. Your eyes might actually like dart around if I was measuring eye movement, which is why REM is rapid eye movement, REM, rapid eye movement. And this is when dreaming occurs. And so what's interesting is that your motor cortex, if I was measuring brainwave activity, is super active, because in your dreams, you're like acting out what's happening in your body. Your brain is basically pretending that this thing is happening. But this is where that paralysis comes in. Basically, your brainstem is blocking those messages from actually going out to the rest of your body. So your brain thinks it's moving and doing all these things, whatever, punching something, whatever you're doing in your dream, but your brainstem actually blocks your body from acting on those things. And so that's kind of cool. And it's a good thing that it does that. Otherwise, you would be like doing kung fu or something in your sleep, or jumping out your window or something like that. So basically what's happening is that internally, like our brain and body is aroused, but externally, you just look like a sleeping person. You're laying there and you wouldn't know that any dreaming is happening. We spend about 100 minutes a night in REM sleep. It gets longer as the night goes on, and we'll talk about that next. But yeah, if you've ever seen like your creepy. He sleeps with his eyes kind of like half open, and I can actually, when he's in REM, his eyes start like moving really fast. It's kind of freaky. I shut his eyes a lot of the time because it scares me. But that is the REM sleep, rapid eye movement. We're dreaming. Inside, our body's completely aroused, but outside we look calm and peaceful. And so this chart shows us that throughout the night how the sleep cycle works. So basically, if you look, especially for you guys, young adults, you're the top chart here in the orangey pink color. But our NREM sleep gets shorter as the night goes on. So this is the different cycles: cycle 1, cycle 2, hour 3, hour 4, hour 5 of sleep. And why that happens is because the first time we fall into NREM 3 is when we're most tired, right? It's right after you've gone to bed for the night. And so we really need that deep delta sleep, and so we stay in it longer. And then we cycle back up to REM. It's a little bit shorter, but then we fall back to NREM 3. And as the night goes on, as I get more rest and I feel less tired, I need less of that deep wave sleep. And then instead, I spend more time in that dreamlike state, having the dreams, processing those things. So just, you need to know that, especially in young adults. Basically, we spend less time as the night goes on in NREM 3, and then we spend more time in REM. So NREM 3 gets shorter, REM gets longer. Older adults spend even less time in NREM 3, and basically that's because they're fully developed. You guys, like we've talked about, your brains are still developing, and so you need that extra restful sleep. Whereas adults, they've already fully developed their brain. They don't need as much time to like recover. And so adults spend less time in that deep restful sleep at night versus you guys who need it more. The other couple of things that you need to know from this unit is like the functions of why we sleep. So like evolutionary speaking, why can't I just stay up 24 hours a day? Why do I have to go to bed? And there's a couple of theories behind that. One is that it protects us, basically saying like at night, we don't have good vision as like animals. So think back in the day from an evolutionary perspective. I can't see that great at night, but predators can. Predators have good night vision. So it just makes sense for us to go to bed and to sleep at night, because then we're protecting ourselves basically from those predators. Or even like walking off a cliff. If I can't see good at night and I'm walking around and I step off a cliff, well, there ends the gene pool because I died. So from an evolutionary perspective, it protects us. It's also hypothesized, and again, we don't know necessarily all of these things. It's probably a combination of them, but these are different theories, and you just need to kind of be aware of them. It could also help. It helps us recuperate. We know that when we're sleeping, we see brain tissue healing and forming and changing. And so as a developing mind, especially as you guys with as teenagers, it's a good thing. It helps us recuperate and build that brain tissue. If you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, it helps us make memories. And we actually do know this. We know that parts of the brain associated with memory do function and kind of activate throughout the sleep cycle at night. And so kind of like in the movie Inside Out, where they've got those little memory balls and then they shoot them down to long-term storage, that's kind of what people think happen in regards to our memories at night as well. As we're dreaming, those things get filed away into the long-term storage. It's also believed that it can create or feed creative thinking. If you've ever like gone to bed like stressing about something, and then you like wake up and it's like, aha, I have had this aha moment. For some reason that seems to happen. And then lastly, we also know that, again, with you guys being teenagers, there is a role of growth in regards to sleep as well. We know that when you're sleeping, the pituitary gland actually releases the growth hormone. And so that is definitely an important aspect of sleeping, and why we sleep is growth and experiencing those things. The other thing that's important then is understanding what happens when I don't sleep. And as teenagers, I know you don't sleep enough, and I tell my students this over and over again, and I preach about this, but it really is so important. You're better off getting a good night's sleep before a test than staying up and cramming. Sleep loss, like at a consistent level, if you're consistently not sleeping enough, makes you more susceptible to depression. You will rate your life overall as less happy if you overall are not sleeping enough. In general, we see weight gain. You also have a suppression of your immune system, so you become more compromised and more likely to get sick. You have a slower reaction time, so more accidents, which causes all kinds of problems. And then we also see less intelligence and poorer performance. So basically, all of this means is that you need to be sleeping, and it is important to set aside time to get that sleep because it's not healthy. Typically, I don't know that they're going to need to really quiz you on all of these factors, but just understanding the importance of sleep in regards to health is kind of the big idea with this slide. The other big thing that this unit covers is the sleep disorder. So why I'm not getting enough sleep at night. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these because I think maybe most of them are fairly common, but just being able to identify each one is the key. So insomnia is the first one. Oops. Sorry, I thought I had slides for that. Insomnia is basically just the inability to sleep. It's like when you're up at night and you're tossing and turning. And it's not just oh, I slept bad last night and so I'm crabby today. Insomnia is a consistent pattern of not being able to sleep and not get enough sleep. And so then we start to see all of those long-term health risks, depression, anxiety, weight gain, sickness, all of those things that go along with it. There's a really interesting disorder, and it's super tragic and super sad, but if you're interested, it's called fatal familial insomnia. I'll throw it in here, fatal familial insomnia. And basically, if you have this disorder, what happens is you just one day stop sleeping and you never sleep again until it's called fatal familial insomnia, until you die. And so what happens is you end up not sleeping. And within a matter of weeks, maybe months, you end up passing away because your body cannot function without sleep. And there's no cure for this. And it's actually, they pinpointed the genetics behind it. And so if you're a carrier, you have it, and you have it. And if you don't, you don't. It's super rare. So it's not something that you need to worry about. But if someone in your family was diagnosed with it, then you would definitely want to get checked because it's just one of those things that you'd probably want to know about. But it's just this really interesting, there's a documentary on the BBC about it. And it just talks about, it really shows us the effects of lack of sleep to an extreme level. And we see how it plays out when someone does not get any sleep over a period of time. Narcolepsy is kind of the opposite problem. Narcolepsy is falling asleep when you don't want to. There's some videos up there of narcoleptic dogs, so it's not just a human thing. But basically, you literally just slip into sleep. You could be mid-sentence. You could be driving a car. And so people with narcolepsy often have a lot of restrictions on their life because you wouldn't want someone with narcolepsy to drive a car because a lot of times they can't tell when it's going to happen. So it's not like you would have time to pull over, put the car in park, and then fall asleep. It's you just fall into sleep. There are treatments for it. There's medications that help, but you still want to take precautions. One of my best friend's sisters has narcolepsy, and it was truly we would be sitting having a conversation, and all of a sudden I'd be like, hey, and she would be sleeping, and it was what? But that's literally what can happen. You can actually fall right into REM sleep too, so you can go from being wide awake to dreaming in an instant. Sleep apnea is just kind of having trouble breathing and stuff when you're asleep. Basically, you wake up and you feel like you're choking, or you might not wake up and then have trouble breathing. And so it's kind of scary if you hear someone with sleep apnea, they stop breathing while they're sleeping temporarily. And there's machines and stuff. If you've ever seen the big masks that people wear on their face, it forces air into their lungs and it keeps them breathing while they're asleep. And then the last disorder is called night terrors. This is much more common in children. Night terrors have to do with they're not nightmares. And so I really want you to make a note if you're taking notes, or be clear about that. A night terror is not the same thing as a nightmare. Night terrors happen in NREM 3. Dreams or nightmares would happen in REM sleep. So these are totally different things. But night terrors are just extreme, basically like a freak out happens, but it happens in NREM 3. And so the body starts kind of freaking out. And there's it's a really scary thing. And it often happens more in kids, and kids tend to grow out of it, but that's basically the gist of it. So just make sure you know that it's not just a nightmare. There's physiological things that happen with night terrors versus a nightmare is just a bad dream. Okay. And then the last thing that we're going to go over is the reasons what we dream and talking about that, the content of our dreams. And so, I mean, you could go online and do like a dream dictionary and look up like, oh, I dreamed about a dog. What does that mean? And those, I mean, are fun kind of pop culture, but we don't hold a lot of credence to those things in psychology. Contrary to like what Freud would say, few dreams are sexual in nature. Usually what happens in dreams, if we're actually like monitoring someone's sleep and then having them record what they've dreamt about, it's usually just stuff from the previous day. And that like lends credence to that idea about memories, right? If our dreams are about what happened the day before, it would make sense because our brain is processing those memories. And so that's why they get incorporated into our dreams. We also incorporate outside sensory influence. I mentioned that about the phone ringing into our dreams. So we know that there's still a little bit of perceptual consciousness or awareness that's happening even when we're asleep or in a dream state. So why do we dream then? Freud would say, if we're going back to like his ideas, it's to satisfy our own wishes. If in real life I can't express these deep, dark feelings and deep, dark emotions, well, then in my dreams I can. And that's why I dream, is to like live out those desires and those things that would be taboo to do in like regular society. And so this is key. These two words, manifest content and latent content, those come up a lot on the AP test. And the manifest content is the actual remembered storyline of the dream. So I have a recurring dream. Actually, I haven't in a while, and now I'm going to talk about it, and I'll probably have it tonight, and it's a nightmare, so I'm going to not sleep good. But I have a dream of being chased by dogs. And basically, dogs or wolves. It sometimes switches. I'm like running around the outside of my house, and these wolves are chasing me, and I like keep running past the door, but I can't get in, and I can't get in. And that's like the whole dream, and it always freaks me out, and I wake up. That's the manifest content of the dream. That's what's actually happening in the story of the dream. The latent content then would be like if you tried to interpret what that dream meant. Well, I'm being chased in that dream, so maybe I have a deadline that's approaching that's making me nervous, and so I'm trying to like get away from this deadline that's like chasing me. That would be the latent content, like the interpretation of what whatever that dream means. Freud was very like into like these dreams are all about sex, and so he would say most adult dreams have to do with like erotic wishes. Like, for example, if you had a gun in your dream, the gun represents your penis, and so whatever you're doing with the gun is what you want to do like with your penis. And so Freud had some weird stuff going on, and you'll talk more about him later, but that's like the gist of his beliefs. And he thought that if I could interpret your dreams, then I could help you if you were having other like psychological problems. So Freud is more of a historical perspective. We don't necessarily like buy into this today, but because he's such an important psychologist, you still have to like know his theories and his ideas. All right. Why we dream: to file away memories. We also like briefly mentioned this, but think about Inside Out again. Basically, it files the day's experiences. And this matters for you. If you're studying like right before bed, getting that good night's sleep and getting that good restful NREM3 and REM sleep could really help you file away those memories of whatever you studied, instead of like staying up extra late and then not getting a good night's sleep and not getting a full restful night. Another theory about why we dream has to do with developing and preserving neural pathways. Basically, it's hypothesized that like my brain practices things when I'm sleeping. So if I'm like learning a new skill, and those neural pathways are like forming in my brain to learn how to play the guitar. And so those neural pathways are starting to form, but I'm not very good yet. Basically, like when I'm sleeping, my brain practices those things and strengthens those neural pathways to help me get better at it. Another theory would be just to basically like make sense of the static. Because there's electricity and things flowing through my brain at all times, my brain tries to interpret it. And when I'm sleeping, there's not a lot of sensory stuff going on. And so basically, the brain just is trying to understand that randomness. There's not much more to do than that. And then lastly, to reflect cognitive development. And so it is basically, it's kind of similar to that practicing neural pathways one. But basically, my dreams reflect what I currently know and understand, and it just engages those networks. So we're going to move on to practice questions. If you have any questions about either the dreams/sleep stuff or the drug stuff, you can still throw them in the questions. But if you look at the polls at the bottom, it says polls. There's 5 of them. I'll just give you guys a second to interact here. The first question, so question 1 in the poll, which of the following is evidence for cultural influence on sleep patterns? So take a second, jump into the poll, and kind of think about what you want to respond to. I'm just going to stress and reiterate like I always do. There's no penalty for guessing on the AP test, so you should always guess. If you run out of time, you should always guess the same letter. And then look for keywords. So in this word, cultural is going to be the hint to what the answer is. So looks like, has anyone voted? Make sure you're voting in the poll here for question 1. Is anyone doing that? And if you aren't sure, just take a guess. It's anonymous, so no one's going to know if you're wrong, but the choices are A, B, C, D, or E. Got 1 guessing. There's a few more of you here. I'll wait another few seconds. All right, so yeah, the answer for this one is A, because what the gist here is cultural influence would be having to do with where you live. And so people in countries without electric lights generally sleep longer. So that means if I live in a society where I don't have access to light, I probably go to bed earlier because it gets dark early and there's nothing else to do if I don't have electric lights. If I do have electric lights, then that influences my sleep patterns and I stay up later. And so the cultural, that word there is the key. Even if you didn't know that, I think just looking at the word cultural could give you a hint for how to answer that question. Question 2, the emotional tone of our dreams is especially likely to be influenced by activation of the blank during REM sleep. So this is what you're going to start seeing more and more of, and you can answer the question in poll number 2. Poll number 2. Once you know it, go in there. But you're going to start seeing this more and more. This question relies on information from a previous unit. And so that's why it's so important, even if you're past the bio unit, go back and review it, because now you need to know stuff about bio to answer this question about sleep as well. And so that's something that's going to, as we move throughout the year, happen more and more. And so making sure that you've reviewed previous units and really understand it is going to help you do a lot better in current units. So for this one, question 2, the answer is limbic system. And if you remember back to the bio unit, limbic system has to do with emotion. And so even if you weren't sure about this, if you just saw emotion, you're like, well, which part of the brain deals with emotion? It's the limbic system. It would help you get to that answer. Question 3 asks, at 3 o'clock in the morning, John has already slept for 4 hours. As long as his sleep continues, we can expect an increasing occurrence of, so basically what is he going to get more of as the night goes on? So in the poll for question 3, take a shot. So what we talked about is that basically, yep, you're going to get more REM sleep. Yes, the amygdala is a limbic system that deals with emotion. That is perfect. That is a great explanation of that last question. Great. Yeah, you have to kind of know the pieces. It was a trick question, or not a trick question, but you had to know parts of the limbic system to be able to answer that emotion question. For this question, question 3, it's REM sleep. We talked about that, but basically you don't get as much NREM 3 as the night goes on because your body is starting to get more rested and it's starting to feel better and it doesn't need it. Question 4, LSD and other powerful hallucinogenic drugs are chemically similar to and therefore block the action of the neurotransmitter serotonin. At the synapses, these drugs act as a blank. This is a hard question. Take a second, read it through, see if you can mark the answer in the poll for question number 4. All right, the answer for this one is actually D, antagonist. And so let me explain that. So remember in the bio unit, we talked about agonist versus an antagonist, and those are things that mimic neurotransmitters. And so there's a couple keywords here. It's saying chemically similar to. So it's hinting at that, like it's mimicking that neurotransmitter. And then it's saying it's blocking the action of it. And remember, if you were here the day we did that review, but an antagonist blocks, like in a story, an antagonist blocks or prevents the hero from like doing their thing. And so an antagonist in the body blocks the neurotransmitter from doing its thing. And so it's actually an antagonist. That's a tricky one. Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because it pulls on a couple different units worth of knowledge. And then the last question for tonight, this one, again, it's kind of tricky. I think you can answer it just by like knowing your vocab and kind of understanding it. But REM sleep is called paradoxical sleep because, and so if you know what like a paradox is, you should probably get this. But take a second and see if you can come up with an answer. All right, so let's see what we got here in the polls. Yeah, B is the correct answer because if something's a paradox, it like seems contradictory, right? And so the fact that when we're in REM sleep and we're dreaming, our nervous system is super active, our brain is firing, it looks like there's all this action happening. But if I look at you, you're just like restfully, peacefully sleeping. And so that's like a paradox. It seems weird. It doesn't match. Good. And then the last thing that I'm going to go over tonight, I'm just going to throw up this FRQ, just a few reminders, the chug sodas, be concise, handwriting, underline, all of that. But if any of you want to take a shot at answering this, I'll stick around for about 5 more minutes. Otherwise, this is kind of the end of my session tonight. I'm not going to really present any more new info, so if you don't feel like trying to answer this FRQ, that's totally fine. Just make sure you register for next week. We're going to start the sensation and perception unit, which is a big unit with lots of information to cover. If you do want to stick around, like I said, I'll stay for about 5 more minutes. And if you want to take a shot at composing this FRQ response, I can give you some feedback just in the comments here if you don't feel too shy about doing that. So I'm just going to kind of hang out for about 5 more minutes, give you a chance to respond, and we'll talk through it a little bit. Maybe I'll start talking through it a little bit. But basically, Professor Dement believes that different states of consciousness are associated with increased levels of activity in specific different parts of the brain. Using this hypothesis, the use of LSD will increase productivity in the somatosensory cortex, even with the absence of visual stimuli. Use the following terms correctly in your response. So you'd have to identify an independent variable, and then you would have to apply like hallucinogenic drugs to that hypothesis or experiment. All right, so I'm just going to hang tight for a few minutes if you want to respond. Otherwise, does the chat stay live when I log off? Because maybe I'll just video log off. I don't know. I'll stay on just in case. I'll just stay on right here. Oh, perfect. Okay, yeah. If you're wanting to see an example of the response, I didn't type anything out, but I'll just type it here in the notes. I'm not sure if anyone else is here watching or listening, so I'll just go with it. If you are working on a response right now, just feel free to still throw it in there. So basically, for independent variable, we always just start with defining the word. So I would just say like an independent, I'm having trouble typing, independent variable is the factor being tested or manipulated in an experiment. Okay, I'm spelling stuff wrong. I'm just trying to type fast. So that's the definition part. And you can just continue then by saying, in this experiment, the independent variable would be, and now I actually have to read my experiment, the presence or would be LSD. So because if I had to do an experiment to test this, it would be some people would be given LSD and some wouldn't, and then I would be comparing the results of their somatosensory cortex because it's already giving me that information that I want to see the effects of LSD on that thing. So I defined independent variable, and then I've identified it in the experiment, and that would be full points for independent variable. Hallucinogenic drugs, then I would start the same way. I'm just going to abbreviate HD. Hallucinogenic drugs are psychoactive substances which alter perception without sensory input. That's my definition for that one. And then now I have to talk about whether or not, like how this plays out in the experiment, because I'm trying to test whether or not hallucinogenic drugs are causing an altered state of consciousness. So knowing what I know about hallucinogenic drugs, I would expect to see there to be more activity in the somatosensory cortex. In this experiment, we could anticipate seeing more excitation in the somatosensory cortex because drugs like LSD activate our sensory experiences even without input. And then you could even like go further. Oops, why did it do that? You could even go further and then like relate it back to saying that like people without the drugs may not have such heightened or extreme activity. So basically you're telling me that you know what hallucinogenic drugs are, and then you're saying that you also know what they do. They impact the somatosensory cortex. And so if we're comparing two people, one on drugs and one not, we would see that heightened activity in one area and not the other. Does that make sense? So that's just a little, I think, gist of what that would look like for a FRQ. What you're also going to start to see with FRQs is that they, on the AP test, it's not all from one unit. So you're not going to get an FRQ with just words from the bio unit or just words from the consciousness unit, and they're going to pull in other terms. So the more that we can continue to build topics, which I really try to do each week, is linking things back, the better off you are because it'll make the FRQs a lot easier. So that's really all I have tonight. If you guys want more feedback, you can get on that Facebook page. I'm not sure if you guys are on there, but if you are on the student Facebook page for AP Psych, I do get notifications to my phone. I try to respond when I see them. It hasn't been super active lately, but if you want more feedback, feel free to go on there and I will give you some feedback. So otherwise, hopefully that was helpful. And then I will see you next week when we talk about sensation and perception. Have a good night.